Nous sommes le sous-comité.
This is the subcommittee on international human rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development.
And today is April 21st, 2009. We have a distinguished guest with us today, but before turning to our guest and inviting him to provide testimony, I am just going to briefly remind members of the subcommittee of the fact that a special meeting to deal with scheduling has been called for tomorrow at 1 p.m. This will allow us, I hope, to deal with matters that were not fully dealt with at our most recent meeting without doing what my great fear is, without doing what could happen if we were to try and fit in scheduling matters into our normal schedule, which is we would push out the witnesses who have come before us. I won't presume to speak to what will happen at that meeting, but I will just draw your attention to a little bit about how I'm going to conduct myself at that meeting. I will very briefly want to deal with a procedural question at the front end, and I would want to do that out of camera in public, and then move in camera to deal with the actual matters that are before us. And the procedural matter I'll be dealing with, just so you know, is I want to explain how I plan to conduct myself in all such meetings, so that everybody's clear on the kind of the rules that I'm setting for myself. These don't necessarily include rules that are, or interpretations of the parliamentary rules. They're effectively rules I'm presenting for my own conduct that I think will ensure that all members understand that I'm trying to be impartial as I deal with these matters. That being said, I will now draw everybody's attention to our witness. Sharif Behruz is here as a representative of the Kurdish Democratic Party in Iran, and he has a presentation to make to us. Mr. Behruz, we invite you to make your presentation, and at the end of it, members of the subcommittee will have a series of questions for you. We are very glad to have you here before our committee to deal with this very important matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chairman. Thank you, honourable members, for being present at this testimony. It's a great honor to have all of you here, and as well as thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about human rights conditions in Iran, particularly the condition of national minorities, as referred to ethnic minorities in Iran, which make about more than half of the population in Iran. You might have my presentation in front of you, and it might be a bit lengthy, but I will try to not go into all the details and summarize the testimony as much as I can, so we can leave more time for questions, that we could get into more conversation about human rights in Iran. Distinguished members of House of Commons, ladies and gentlemen, first allow me to thank all the honourable members of Subcommittee on Human Rights on behalf of the people of Iran, particularly the people of Iranian Kurdistan, for putting together these series of parliamentary hearings on the situation of human rights in Iran under the Islamic Republic. Human rights violation in Iran is systematically engineered through institutions where social, political, and activists have been oppressed systematically and widely, and their fundamental rights and freedoms have been infringed. Iran, under the Islamic Republic, has become a large prison for the whole of its population, and any dissent, expression, and activism is deemed as a threat to national security of the Islamic establishment. The people of Iran within the last 3 decades have witnessed the worst barbarism inflicted upon them by the Islamic regime in Iran. The international community, especially the United Nations human rights body, has condemned Iran's treatment of its people more than 22 times within the last 30 years. However, Iran's isolation from the international community and the seal that the regime has placed on the society, especially on the areas inhabited by the ethnic indigenous population, conceals the true extent of human rights violation in Iran under the Islamic regime. As you all might know, about more than half of Iran's population belongs to national and religious minorities. And for these minorities, Iran is a double prison where on one hand, the entire population suffers from the despotism and tyranny, and on the other hand, people belonging to certain national groups are further deprived economically, politically, and culturally. Despite facet constitutional guarantees of equality and Iran's deceptive international legal commitments, discrimination and repression of minority communities who have been demanding greater respect for their cultural and political rights continues. Kurds, as one of the national minorities in Iran, along with Azeris, Turkmens, Baluchis, and Arabs, have long suffered deep-rooted discrimination. Their social, political, and cultural rights have been repressed, as there have economic aspirations. Kurdish regions have been economically neglected, resulting in entrenched poverty and hopelessness, which has in turn resulted in various psychological disorders. The 8-year war with Iraq in the 1980s and the emergency rules in the Kurdish areas in the last 3 decades has resulted in extrajudicial killings, forced evictions and resettlements, and destructions of homes and cities. Parents are banned from registering their babies with certain Kurdish names, while Persian and Islamic names are suggested and forced upon parents. The use of the Kurdish language and other nationalities' language and education system are prohibited. Religious minorities that are mainly or particularly Kurdish are targeted by measures designed to stigmatize and isolate them. The discriminatory guzinish or screening system, a selection procedure that requires prospective officials, state officials, employees, and students to demonstrate allegiances to Islam and the Islamic Republic of Iran, denies Kurds inequality in employment, education, and political participation. Islamic Republic of Iran's constitution provides for equality of all Iranians before the law. However, this is not the reality in practice. Iran is a state party to International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenants on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. However, every international convention on human rights is widely violated in Iran, and the violation of these rights are at their extreme in the Kurdish and areas inhabited by other national and religious minorities. An estimated 12 million Kurds live in Iran, and they make up about 17% of the population. They live mainly in the provinces of West Azerbaijan, Kurdistan, Kermanshah, and Elam in the west and northwest of the country, although many may have moved to the big cities such as Tehran in the last 3 decades to seek better employment and living opportunities. There's also a community of Kurds in North Khorasan province in northeastern Iran and that have been forcefully relocated during the 18th century to disperse the ethnic and religious composition of then the Persian Empire. Distinguished members of the House of Commons, we do not intend to remind Canadians of the difficulties faced by Iranians, freedom activists, and right activists in Iran. The death of Zahra Kazemi, the Iranian-Canadian photojournalist, opened Canada's eye to the atrocities that people in Iran are confronted with by the hour. In my remarks, I would like to draw your attention to a more general, systematic, and chauvinistic violation of human rights in Iranian Kurdistan and other areas inhabited by non-Persian that require immediate international intervention and mediation. I'd like to start by examining the educational discrimination and apartheid in the Kurdish areas of Iran. Islamic Republic of Iran's constitution guarantees that every ethnic and national minority should have the right to be educated in their own language, and this has been entrenched in the constitution of the Islamic Republic, but since for the last 30 years this has not been enacted and it has not been put into action, and every children or every child that goes to school has to be educated and forced to be educated in Persian language, and that's a huge discrimination and contrary to the international Human Rights Declaration and other international conventions. Aside from the painful fact that they are deprived from the right to be educated in their own language, they're also deprived from many resources that could be available to them, and even in Persian languages there are not many resources they could have access to. For example, libraries and educational materials are rarely available. Kids have to pay for their educational materials most of the time, especially in rural areas, and there are really rarely any secondary or higher education in the rural areas for Kurdish, and sometimes kids at the early 6 years old, not only they have to be forced to be educated in Persian, but also they are relocated to different towns and cities and rural, bigger villages and townships that have elementary schools, and this is a huge discrimination against the population, all the ethnic areas, especially in the Kurdish areas. And to enforce the official language, usually the government requires that all the educators to educate the young and the youth and the kids in Persian language. And for that matter, usually do not allow, for example, Kurdish educators to be present in the school to enforce the official language policy. And sometimes the Kurdish who have been graduated, who are teachers, are usually relocated to other areas in Iran, who then have to speak other languages than their own language, which is Kurdish. The enrollment in higher education is also very discriminatory. As I mentioned earlier, there is a screening criteria that's set in place in Iran that make sure that every individuals or every applicant who wants to enroll in the higher education make sure they apply or they comply with Iranian screening system, which has to do with being affiliated with the government or the government officials, or being part of a militia force, and many of the criteria that are set in Iran for Kurds and other nationalities to be able to educate in Persian language. As for the cultural and religious rights, Iranian Kurds, who are mostly Sunni, are from the Sunni sect, they are treated as minorities, and so the Kurds not only are ethnic minority, but also they're a religious minority. Sunni Islams, as like Baha'is and other religious minorities, are treated with suspicions and with respect. For example, the establishment and the creation of Shia Muslim mosques are heavily promoted and encouraged in non-Shia areas, for example, in the Kurdish areas, but the creation and building of Sunni Muslim mosques, especially in a city like Tehran with 1 million population of Sunnis, is prohibited in Iran. And there have been a lot of special reports on this. The latest one being Amnesty International reported that Sunni Kurdish clerics have not only been blocked from practicing their religion in many spheres, but also they have been hunted down by the security forces, and sometimes because of speaking up against the atrocities that goes on against these population. And there have been many instances where these figures, religious figures, have been disappeared or have been tortured and then returned back to their centers. So there's quite a lot of hardship that the religious figures in Iran go through. And there are other religious groups aside from Sunnis who are somewhat officially recognized as part of Sunni Islam, but there are other religious groups as Baha'is and Yarsans who are not recognized, and they are treated very badly, and sometimes any activism on their part to promote their religion is treated with suspicion, disrespect, and as well as a lot of them are actually faced with hardship that usually they go through long-term imprisonments, and lately one minority religious activist was actually sentenced to death and executed. Irrespective of religion, Kurds are not allowed to name their children in Kurdish, so they're forced to name their Kurdish in Islamic names or Persian names. For example, Babak is a Persian name, as a historical Persian name, is heavily suggested in the Persian, in the registry centers, while Kurdish name like Flag, which means Allah, or other Kurdish names are heavily prohibited. And a lot of centers, all the centers, have a list of names that actually parents could actually name their children. And this is practiced in the embassies as well. So if Iranian nationals want to go to Iranian embassy in Canada to name their children, to get the birth certificates, they have to pick from a certain names. And this is a huge discriminatory, and it's actually been condemned by a lot of human rights organizations, especially later report by Amnesty International as well. Kurdish areas have been heavily neglected in terms of investments and employment opportunities. The 8-year Iraq-Iran war really destroyed the economy, the infrastructure, and pretty much the environment of that area, because much of the Iran-Iraq war was in the Kurdish areas. I would say about 80% of it